Good afternoon to everyone that's here with us, joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our first Ask Me Anything session on risk management for SMEs. This is the first in a new series of sessions we are holding to connect the business community directly with experts, and we hope to keep holding these as a means of ensuring those who require support will receive it from leading lights of the Gulf's business community. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Pearl Initiative, the Pearl Initiative is the leading and only independent non-profit organisation founded to promote business case for the implementation of the highest standards in corporate governance, transparency and accountability across the Gulf region's private sector. Launched in 2010 in cooperation with the United Nations Office for Partnerships, the Pearl Initiative aims to convene businesses, decision makers and future young leaders to take the lead in promoting and adopting greater standards of governance. The Pearl Initiative engages the wider business ecosystem in the Gulf region, collaborating with over 40 companies, and also engages with 30 regional universities to collectively drive our mission forward. We work as a think tank and build data by publishing cutting-edge research reports and case studies to inspire business change. As I mentioned earlier, this Ask Me Anything session falls under the remit of our Governance in MSMEs program. Micro, small and medium-sized enterprises are considered the backbone of the regional economy and account for between 80% and 90% of registered companies across the region. However, their contribution to regional GDP does remain quite low. As SMEs compete with each other in a saturated marketplace and strive to be both innovative and fiscally sustainable, they must understand the fact that implementing corporate governance is the key to facilitating their growth and success. The Pearl Initiative understands the necessity of good governance for small business success, and in 2017, we launched our Governance in SMEs program to engage small businesses on the importance of corporate governance for positive economic outcomes. Good governance is flexible and can be modified to fit a business's particular needs. It is certainly not meant solely or reserved for the realm of multinationals and large corporations as often perceived. MSMEs will find that applying governance policies and practices will help them build a stronger, more resilient and more profitable business than before. About today's session, I'm pleased to present this novel Ask Me Anything session for the SME and broader economic community in the Gulf. The intention of this session is to leading expert address the most pressing questions faced by the business community on a particular topic. For this session, given the current regional and global climate, we were aware that our core stakeholders were most invested in understanding more about risk management and how they could mitigate and avoid certain risks. MSMEs are facing a tremendous amount of uncertainty these days between the impacts of COVID-19, uncertain business futures and changing economic realities. MSMEs are facing the brunt of the impact. Risk management therefore becomes a critical segment of an SME's business planning and operations. But as the potential for numerous risks is currently high, and as the business world continues to combat the shifts created by the pandemic, it is challenging to know where to begin. We've therefore brought you Ms. Nadine Mizha to lead today's session. Welcome, Nadine. Thank you for joining us. Nadine is the co-founder and CEO. Nadine Mizha is the co-founder and CMO of Saiwa, the first automated investment advisory platform in the region, regulated by the Dubai Financial Services Authority. Nadine co-founded Saiwa after years of experience in marketing and communication strategy, with a track record of successful projects delivered for clients ranging from startups to government entities and large-scale companies. Prior to that, she worked at Dubai Tourism and Commerce Marketing, Government of Dubai in retail strategy and strategic alliances, as well as festivals and events development. Nadine holds a Bachelor of Business Administration and Marketing from the American University of Beirut, as well as a degree in design from ESMO Paris. Nadine, welcome, and thank you again for giving us your time and imparting your insights with us today. If you haven't already submitted your questions during the session registration process, please do feel free to use the Q&A tool on the right side of your screen to submit the questions in real time to Nadine, and Nadine will do her best to address those for you. Thanks again to all of you for joining, and thanks again, Nadine, and let's kick off. Over to Nadine.
Should I start? Thank you for having me. I've been asked by the Pearl Initiative to come and talk to you today, and I'm hoping I can add some value. So as Yasmin was mentioning, I'm one of the co-founders at Saiwa. Saiwa is an online digital advisor, so basically financial advisor. What we do is we help people invest their money in international markets. We do that using exchange-traded funds, so it's what we call passive investing. We're rooted in passive investing. We launched Sarwa around 3 years ago, so we were part of an accelerator in the IFC, in the Dubai International Financial Center. And we were part of the first cohort, graduated, got our license from the FSA. And now we are expanding the business. So we're regulated in Dubai, we're regulated into Abu Dhabi, and then we're expanding regionally across the GCC. So again, as Yasmin was mentioning, I've been asked to come and talk about my experience when it comes to risk management, to corporate governance, and why is it important for business owners to actually focus on that from the get-go. Ultimately, when it comes to risk management, at least my view on it is that it sits in the center of proper corporate governance. So it's corporate governance, if you may think about it, is a framework or a stepping stone. And it's extremely important to have in place to be able to build a sustainable business, to be able to be very efficient, to work, on a company that is growing fast, especially within the environment that we currently operate within. So for my end, it's extremely important to incorporate risk management in the business planning from the get-go, to have it sit ultimately in the center of it and not separately. So that's something very, very important, because it is a stepping stone, as I mentioned, for good decision making. It's the support of good decision making, while at the same time balancing between actually making sure that you're mitigating any risk and you're managing properly the risk that you may face without really inhibiting the growth. So it's always a balance, I would say, between the two, making sure you're taking enough risk to grow the company, but at the same time, making sure that you have all the right processes and procedures and manuals in place to be able to face any unforeseen circumstances. So that's my quick intro about my personal view on corporate governance and how we at Sarwa, hopefully I can share with you our experience and how we actually came about to putting all the procedures in place.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nadine. By way of introduction for everyone in the audience, my name is Shruti and I work with the Pearl Initiative on the Governance and MSMEs program. We're very excited to have Ms. Nadine here with us. I'm going to be fielding the questions for her. So I'd like to kick this session off with a really timely question about risk management. I think that's coming from a member of the audience. When should a business or an entrepreneur begin to think about risk management?
So I think, as I mentioned before, it's ideally from the get-go. You really want to think about it as inherently part of the business planning. So whenever you want to start thinking about your business, you really want to start considering risk management. It's not as easy, it's not as easy done, just like as we'd like to think, because ultimately as business owners, we tend to wear a lot of multiple hats. We have to take care of, the management of a business, the day-to-day operation, the growth, and all of this. So we always end up sort of putting, corporate governance and risk management on the shelf until we think, you know what, now I have the time to focus on that. The reality is, ideally, you want to start from the get-go, because you need to have the right tools in place to be able to operate the business, specifically when there are uncertain circumstances surrounding you. So it is something that I would consider extremely important to have when you start building your business.
Great, thank you so much. There's an adjacent question here. What are some of the initial risk management protocols which a company can put in place?
Okay, good question. I would start by thinking about the business and the environment I operate within, and then thinking about identifying the risks that you can face as a company. So again, depending on your market, depending on your industry, depending on laws and regulations that you operate within, it's extremely important to understand these risks. For example, for Sarwa, we're a financial institution. So again, there are different risks that we have to have the right procedures for. Versus maybe other industries. However, so I would start by identifying the risks that I need to mitigate against. I would identify the risks that I can take within the possibility of what I can operate in that specific industry. And then once you have that, then you want to go more in depth and you want to think about what's the nature of the risk, what's the probability of that risk actually affecting you, and what is that impact that you want to mitigate against. So make sure that also at the same time you're involving the team. So let's say you have a team around you, so make sure you're involving them step by step, because you want to really put that culture in place from the get-go. Whatever the culture that you want for the organization when it comes to risk management, it has to be part and ingrained in the organization from the beginning. So once you identify these risks, you want to really make sure that you're able to manage them and you're able to actually monitor, you're able to have the right processes to review these risks on regular basis, whether it's quarterly or yearly, so it really, again, depends. And I would say probably the last step, just as an initial process, is to have really clear both internal and external communication processes. So you're able to communicate with the team in case something happens very quickly, with your stakeholders, with your board, so on and so forth. So communication is also very, very key when it comes to risk management.
Thank you very much. There's a question here about your experience with risk management at Sarwa. So what are some of the initial challenges you faced? What are some of the challenges you might be facing now, and how are you addressing them?
Again, I mean, like I mentioned, we are a financial institution, right? So that comes with certain sets of risks. And at the same time, we're a tech company, so that's also another layer of risk that you have to consider. So from a Sarwa perspective, we really had to put all these procedures in place from the get-go. So I would tell you, we have very detailed internal risk management procedures framework that takes into consideration all the different risks that we might face, whether it's from onboarding the client, so how do we get to know the client and the risk associated with taking on a client, how do we mitigate the risk of AML, so anti-money laundering, how do we mitigate the risk that goes with the regulatory frameworks that we operate within. So again, we have very detailed procedures when it comes to regulation and compliance. So we have the procedure manual for compliance, we have monitoring programs, we have very clear information reporting so that we do on a regular basis. I look after marketing, so we have also from a marketing perspective, we have a register for marketing. We do a lot of social listening to make sure that, again, the brand sentiment and everything that's happening within the digital realm, we actually can and monitor and control as much as possible. And also at the same time, of course, there's the security risk. So we have all the data protection necessary, we have all the testing necessary. So we work both internally, so the internal team has really continuous checks that they do all the time, the tech team, to make sure that this holds true. And then we also work with the external agency. So that's something really dependent on the company. You can either take on the risk management capabilities internally, or you can outsource, or you can do a combination of both. So for Sarwa, we do internal. We have an external company that also works on the safety and security, and we work with regulators. So clearly, they're also part of the framework that we have. So they also do auditing, which is another part of actually how we do risk management, continuous meetings, right? So we have the board meetings, we have the internal team meetings, and we have meetings with our regulators.
Thank you so much. What is riskier to merge with, a competitor or a complementary company? Do you have any experience with this?
That's a very interesting question. Personally, I do not. But if I was to think about it very quickly, I would think about the benefits and the risks associated, right? So if you're merging with a competitor, I would say you're actually increasing your market share. And if you're merging with a complementary company, you're increasing your scope. So you're also diversifying the business, which reduces business risk. What would be more risky? Potentially, it's both internal and external, I'd say. Some would have internal risk, some would have external risk. Probably with a competitor, it could be a bit more high on the internal risk. With a complementary company, it could be higher on the external risk because you have to really work hand in hand on a new approach for risk assessment. So ultimately, I think in these specific situations, it's all about really doing your due diligence before you actually seal the deal and make sure that you study the strength and the weaknesses.
Great, thank you so much. What are some of the most common risks that a small business can face, regardless of the sector that they operate in?
There are different risks, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is the financial risk. I think it's all about having, right money management systems in place, because when you're a small business, this is the one thing that's always on your mind is how do you budget, how do you monitor your cash burn, how do you monitor the flow of the cash, so you're not putting pressure on the management team, you're not putting pressure on yourself, you're not putting pressure on your stakeholders. So cash flow is one of the things that ultimately needs to be really thought properly in details, and your business model needs to be built around that to be sustainable. Another one I would say is dependency. So dependency it could be the dependency on a client or on a supplier. I'll give an interesting actually example. I'm reading a book by the founder of Nike, Shoe Dog. Very interesting book actually about how he launched his business. And one of the main issues that he faced is that he was in the initial phase of growth of Nike as the company that we know it today, is that he was relying on one supplier. And when this supplier decided to actually stop working with them, that put them in a very, very tough place. So dependency, I would say, is extremely important to mitigate against. Dependency on a founder. Let's say you're a founder of a business, and I know that from experience that a lot of the investors out there do not necessarily like to invest in a company that has a sole founder. So they typically like to invest in companies that have more than one founder, because you don't want the business to be dependent on one person. So you want to make sure that in case, the business, the owner is busy or he has to, be absent for some reason, the business can continue running. So dependency is another thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of risks when it comes to launching a business, especially when it comes to small businesses. Another one is the reputational risk, the liability risk. So anything that harms the company's reputation and basically creates any negative sentiment towards the business that you're actually building. So you have to have proper policies in place. Another one is security risk, as we discussed earlier. So security, you need to make sure, whether you're a tech company, so whether you operate in the digital front or you're a real company, how do you mitigate security risk, any attack, any, upset clients, any damage of property, so on and so forth. And I would say for small businesses, probably the last thing you also want to keep in mind, which a lot of people don't necessarily think about, is the well-being of the team. So that's an internal risk that you need to also consider, because especially when you're a startup and you're in high growth mode, you don't want to burn out your team, you don't want to burn out yourself. So that's something also you have to consider, is how do you put the right procedures in place to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you so much. So I have to ask now about COVID-19, because of course that's the hottest topic on everybody's minds. COVID-19 has definitely uncovered some novel risks for MSMEs, but clearly financial risks have been the most common by far across the region. What are the most common types of financial risks that you're seeing MSMEs face in this particular period of time? And what do you think can be done to mitigate those risks effectively so that SMEs can transition into a post-pandemic world with ease?
I think, again, the cash on hand for SMEs, right? So it's tough when you want to grow business and you don't want to inhibit that growth to to face the current narrative that COVID brought onto the economy. So a lot of, especially that we know, that a lot of investors right now are actually scaling back on investment or pausing investment, because part of the risk management is on their end is to assess how this is going to impact businesses around. Excuse me, I just realized that my laptop is running out of battery. So I'm just going to plug it. So basically, yes, I would say it's really about cash burn and what you can do to actually make sure that you're working around it. So what we personally did is we took a look at the capital that we have, right? So you consider what you currently have as a capital. Then you remove the immediate payments that you currently have to incur. And then after that, you just take that sum, you divide it by the monthly cash burn that you should be able to know. And that gives you the runway, right? So once you have that time to zero, you start reverse engineering everything and you start putting in place different scenarios, okay? So let's say you put 3 different scenarios, one that's extremely optimistic, the one that's extremely pessimistic, and one that's balanced. And then you start looking into these scenarios and what can you do to actually be able to operate within them. You test these assumptions. You make sure that you run every scenario through everything that you need to make your business successful. So you check, let's say, your cash flow planning, you check your internal communication and external communication with all your stakeholders. Again, communication is extremely important. You check your sales estimations, your revenues, you check everything that has to do, let's say, with marketing spend and how can you reduce that potentially, and your supply chain. So once you have all of these, you start looking into how you can stop any bleeding that's happening and how can you optimize your working capital to make sure that you actually can make it to that zero time. And if you want, there are different scenarios in place. Let's say you have less than 12 months of runway. So what you want to do is really preserve the cash, any cash that you have, you want to preserve it now and you want to start today. So you want to remove anything that's unnecessary, anything that you can delay. Potentially, you can, I know some startups that actually completely stopped marketing spend completely and are just relying on word of mouth and organic growth. So that's something that you can potentially think about. If you have more than 12 months, then you need to also, again, conserve your cash. You need to look into potential opportunities for strategic partnerships, for ways to make, again, and retain all your clients and make them happy. I know my answer has been a bit long, but I think, everyone that's now facing this situation would be probably considering the same.
Right, thank you so very much. So I actually want to go back to your background in marketing and communication strategy. You have this wealth of experience. Do you see any overlap at all between marketing and communications for small businesses and the role that plays in managing or mitigating risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now, especially that we're operating, so we're a tech company. We've been born in the cloud, as we like to say, and we operate fully online. So everything that we do is online. And part of our marketing strategy is majorly digital, right? So it is something that we keep in mind because you do have different ways of hacking the system in today's world, right? So one thing we're always doing is a lot of social listening. We make sure that no one is impersonating the brand out there. So reputational risk is extremely important. We make sure that we don't have any upset client out there that could potentially have a ripple effect. We do a lot of, as I said, social listening to make sure that the sentiment is always positive, that we address any issue right there and then. So we don't have any lag time. We have very detailed procedure for the team internally on how to handle anything that's happening on whether it's social media, whether it's on any ads that we put out there, any communication. So we're heavy on content. We do a lot of education. It's something, so we always monitor. That's number one. Number two is, again, as I mentioned earlier, from a marketing perspective, we have a marketing register of everything that goes out. So any communication, we always make sure that, you know, we're carefully monitoring, carefully looking into. And ultimately, we are also a financial institution. So it is extremely important for us, for the client to feel that they can trust us, that they can they feel confident in actually working with Sarwa and putting their hard-earned money, especially in today's world, with us. So transparency to us is extremely important in everything that we do.
Great, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about your experience with stakeholder management and risk management. Now, I mean, as at Sarwa, you must be dealing with a large number and type of stakeholders, and so everyone would need a different management approach. How do you see risk management and stakeholder management for very different types of stakeholders coming together?
I like this question. I think it boils down to, again, to transparency and communication. Let's say we have our investors, right? So with our investors, it's always been about open communication. That allows us to mitigate a lot of the risks of anything happening. So we do regular updates for our stakeholders, so our investors. We hold quarterly board meetings. So again, the entity, the board entity is extremely important to have in place. Especially if you potentially have independent board members. So that's something we always make sure that we have clear streams of communication with the board. We, with our auditors, so with our regulators, there's yearly auditing, there's quarterly compliance reports that we have in place. We have internally, so that's a lot of external. With our clients, like I said, full transparency across. So on the Sarwa website, we share everything. We share our methodology, we share the constructions of our portfolio, we share very detailed page on pricing and how we price and what we charge. So everything is communicated in full transparency. We also do excuse the work from home. I have my daughter here with me. Juste pas maintenant.
Mais je voulais dire quelque chose. En fait, mamie, t'appuies sur l'eau.
Oui. Mamie, je suis sur un autre après.
We're very happy to welcome new audience members.
Mamie, t'appuies sur l'eau. On met un peu de savon sur les doigts. On met le savon avec toi. So the pepper ran away.
I hope that was of value add. She's explaining if you put pepper on your hand and you drop it in the water and the soap would go around that circle. So there you go. Going back to our compliance and communication, we also do a lot of internal communication. So with the team internally, we have, as a management, we have weekly meetings, and with the entire team, we have weekly meetings. And then depending on the vertical of the team itself, then you also do daily meetings. So the internal smaller structure of the team is meeting on daily basis. And this helps mitigate any risk that you face because you can find a solution very quickly and escalate it very quickly. I hope I went back on track with the question fast enough.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. We've got an interesting question here from the audience. It's about digital risks. So they say digital risks are coming to the forefront of many MSME owners' minds. As an expert on digital systems, what would you recommend MSMEs do to manage digital risks? And what are some of the common digital risks that you've come across?
It's a good question. I think a lot of stories that we hear today is about ways of actually finding any structural weakness within tech and attacking there. So I think it's a lot about exposed data and so on. which could potentially lead to a lot of damage, whether it's reputational damage because something is leaked, or whether it's actually core business damage. So that's something that's extremely important to have in place when it comes to security, when it comes to data protection, and understanding, again, it's all about looking into the threats that surround your business and understanding what are these different types of threats you want to mitigate against, and making sure that you address them from the get-go, and making sure not only that you have really the right procedures in place, but how do you actually detect them. So I'll give you an example. Let's say when it comes to right now, you know, we all are aware of GDPR, right? So the data protection for clients and clients' information. This is extremely important to have in place and to ensure that the entire team is aware of it, because sometimes someone might not know and something might take place. So it ultimately boils down to reducing the surface of attack of any sort of attack, and I'm not talking just purely from a hacker's perspective, but any type of digital attack, whether it's an attack on social media, whether it's an attack on your protection walls. So having these protections in place for today's world is something that sits at the core of what we do at Sarwa. As I mentioned earlier, we have the internal team that's always evaluating these risks, that's always working on highlighting anything that happens, any fraudulent play that we sense is taking place. So right away we flag it, right away we have an escalating process in place, and we make sure we address it as fast as possible. And we have an external security firm that's always testing our security and controls how we actually operate online to make sure that we are implementing the industry's best practices and best standards. And again, like I mentioned, we have regulators that do, you know, regular auditing. So all in all, when it comes to digital, I think clearly security comes first. And we have, of course, all the basics. We like to say that we have the bank level security in place, because we use, of course, the 256-bit encryption to make sure that our website and our app are as secure as can be.
Great, thank you so much. There's a question here about a holistic risk management framework. So what would be the building blocks of a holistic risk management framework?
So just if we consider the terminology itself, holistic is about having that approach that aggregates it all, right? So to me, it's about the interrelationship between all the different risks within a company. So what you really don't want to have is siloed approach across different departments. It's much easier when we're a small organization because you know what's happening across all the different verticals, units, departments, whatever you want to call it. It might become much more difficult when you're a big organization. So it's extremely important to have that from the get-go and make sure that ultimately, when it comes to risk assessment, you have senior management that sets the approach, that looks into the overall business, that understands what are the different risks they need to work towards mitigating, and then take that and cascades it down to the different, you know, departments, units, so on and so forth. And then within these units, within these segments, what you want to do is, again, take it one step deeper and understand what can be done to layer it even better. So that's one way. You can either look into each unit separately and then aggregate all of it, or you want to have that overall arching approach that cascades down to all the different verticals.
Thank you very much. I think what we're going to see in a couple of years, well, maybe as early as the next year, right, is the complete upheaval of the business landscape in the Gulf region. I think a lot of people have been saying that you're going to see a lot more entrepreneurs coming up, especially given that, you know, a lot of traditional businesses have not been doing as well as they have. So people want to take matters into their own hands and build their own destiny, so to say. So this next question from the audience, I think, touches upon that sentiment. What are some operating risks that entrepreneurs must be careful about when they decide to start their own business in this current climate?
You know, when you're a business owner, risk is inherent. Like any business that you launch, you're taking on risk because you still don't know 100% how it's going to pan out. So what you need ideally to have in place is really proper planning. And again, a business plan never really comes implemented as we want it to be, because there's a lot of different variables as you grow the business that come into place, right? But at the same time, I think the first thing you want to do, I would say, especially given my background in marketing, is the market risk. You want to really make sure that you understand your market. You want to make sure, to the best of your capabilities, to have done the research in understanding your clients, in having as many insights into what they want, what they need, and does really your business provide that solution to the problem that they have, right? So ultimately, it's about making sure you get that confirmation, so you're not incurring any risk when it comes to implementing the idea. So that, I would say, is number one. Number two, which we've discussed before, is the financial risk. So because that sits at the core of any business. If you don't have the money to run the business for enough time to make it grow the way you envision it to grow, then you get into this vicious cycle of taking any revenues to close the expenses, and it's a continuous cycle. And ultimately, you're not really growing, you're not scaling. That said, it's extremely important to have a sustainable model in place, right? I think in today's world, especially if we want to talk about startups, a lot of people think that, you know, we need to keep raising funds all the time to grow the business, and it's just like continuous. But ultimately, what investors are really looking for is a sustainable model where you're able to turn it into a proper business that's revenue generating and profit generating. So that's something we always think about, is make sure that you're identifying how you're going to fund that business in order to make it sustainable. And once you get there, just make sure that you stay there. So financial risk is another thing that faces any business owner, I would say. There's a lot of risks, you know, but also one thing that I can think of right now is team risk. So from our end, it was very important for Sarwa to invest in a team that believes in what we're trying to achieve, right? So to us, it's a mission we're deeply proud of, because we want to make investing affordable, accessible for everyone. And anyone that actually joined the Sarwa family has that same passion, and they not only believe in let's say, you as a business owner, but they also believe in what you're trying to achieve. So I think team risk mitigation and risk management is something also that maybe not a lot of people think about.
All right, thank you very much. I just wanted to remind our audience, if you do have any questions for Ms. Nadine, you can use the question and answer tool on the right side of your screen. It's part of the interface for GoToWebinar. We look forward to your questions coming in. So Ms. Nadine, there's been a question about strategy risk. So someone's asked, you know, a lot of companies do look at their strategy and they do try to do everything to mitigate risks before they ever occur. But what happens when your strategy is flawed to begin with? How do you manage risks like that?
I like these questions. I think we talked a little bit very quickly about having the right plan in place and having the right strategy in place. And it doesn't always pan out the way you actually think about it. But at the same time, what you want to really formalize is the decision-making process, right? So when you have a senior management team that knows how to address quickly these changes and how to adapt within a changing environment, then that helps a lot with sound decision-making. A company is always going through different cycles, and it's extremely important that you're able to be flexible, to have that structure in which quick change can take place. Decision making is fast enough, so you're able to very quickly stand on your feet if something happens. You need to make sure that there's a coherent team that can communicate well between each other all the time, continuous basis, because that makes you really adapt to any external environmental change as quickly as you can.
Wonderful, thank you so much. You briefly touched upon the role of a board in the risk management process, but could you talk a little bit more about that, because that's the question that we've had come through.
I remember, I think it was 1 year into Sarwa, and I was on a panel, and someone was asking, do we really need a board? And a lot of my colleagues at this time, and I really was very intrigued in the answer, because at the time we did have a board, but I kept thinking, do really small scale companies, do they really need a board? And ultimately, we realized that the answer is, it is very important to have a board. The board's role is not just to be there to be reported into. It's actually there to help you mitigate any risk and to help you navigate any risk that you have. So I would say the board is really very much at the core of the responsibilities of risk management. It helps you ensure that ultimately you're following all the procedures properly. So whether it's from the design and implementation of all the appropriate risk management procedures that you want to have in place, the internal control systems that you have in place as a company, determine the extent of the risk that you can take and the risks that you should not be taking, right? So as we discussed before, it's all about what we call risk appetite or risk tolerance. And again, going back to what we do as Sarwa, whenever we recommend, let's say, a portfolio investment to a client, we base it on the client's risk assessment and risk management and risk tolerance, sorry. So it boils down to the same approach when it comes to a board, ensuring that you're doing exactly the same. So it's also about agreeing on that level the procedure and how do you want to approach a risk that might come across all of a sudden, and that you have the corrective actions in place to properly address it, whether it's a threat from a competitor or something internal that's really not functioning properly, maybe a disruptive team member. It could be anything, you know. But ultimately, what's important for a business is to understand what are the high-level risks that you need to address from the get-go. And then when it comes to other risks that you will eventually have to face, it's about how fast can you take that corrective action to make sure that it's not something that's repeating, and that you monitor continuously your risk management.
All right, thank you so much. So there's one final question. What is the role of transparency in mitigating and managing business risks? And I'm assuming the person who submitted this question is asking both about internal transparency, but also external transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. Transparency should be at the core of any business. We'd like to think that it is at the basis of what we do in Sarwa, because it's really something that helps you to conduct business in an ethical way, but also in a much more efficient way. So once you have that as a culture within an organization, it becomes so much easier to do proper governance, because everything is clear, everything is there when you need it. So information is available in case you ever wanted to reach out and find something specific. So it makes the business run so much more efficiently, in a smoother manner. You know, to us, transparency is something we hold very dear, very close to us, because this is also how ultimately you cease to have any bad behavior per se, and you make sure that there's a better environment both internally for the team, with the stakeholders, and with the client. So I would say just applying transparency across all the levels of business operation helps you get to your objective so much faster and makes the day-to-day work so much more enjoyable. So to us, it's extremely important, and I think many would agree on that.
All right, thank you very much. As I said, that was the final question. I just want to thank you very much for your time and all your expertise. It's been a delight speaking to you and learning from you throughout the course of this AMA session. I'd also like to thank all our audience members for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for supporting the Pearl Initiative and the work that we do. We hope to continue serving you tirelessly into the future. And we will be holding other webinars and other AMA sessions similar to this one. So we look forward to hearing from you then as well. Thank you so much, Ms. Nadine. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you also learned something from my daughter interrupting here. Maybe that's a completely other session we can have. But thank you for having me. And I hope I added some value.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you and have a lovely day. Take care, everyone.
Bye.